Okay, right. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second of our crisis hours. We have over 90 people registered for today's event, so that's really exciting, and most of them are online at the moment. So my name is Tony Thompson, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome this evening our guest, Lord Toby Harris, who's currently the chair of the National Preparedness Commission. I'll be introducing him in a moment. First of all, I'm sure most of you will be aware of the huge amount of interest in emergency management and emergency preparedness at the moment, particularly in light of the UK's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. But there's many other risks and hazards that we need to prepare for. I'm sure most of you will be aware that the House of Lords Select Committee on Risk Assessment and Risk Planning is currently gathering evidence, and I'm sure many of you will have contributed either personally or through one of your professional bodies. So a brief word about this evening and the format. I have sent to all the people that have registered a summary. I'll just remind you what's going to happen. Lord Toby Harris will speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then you're going to be placed into small breakout rooms of 5 or 6 to consider 3 questions, which you should already have, but I will remind you of those at the time. So the breakout rooms will last for about 25 minutes, and we've identified a facilitator for each of those rooms. And we will tell the lucky people who they are at the end of Lord Toby Harris's talk. And then I'd be grateful if those specially hand-picked facilitators could pick up during their discussions with their teams the key points in relation to the questions that we've posed and feed them back into the main room when we come back for the final 15 minutes. Now, clearly in the time available and the numbers of people that we've got, we're not going to be able to get everybody to feed back. So I would ask, I will be asking some random or groups randomly to feed back, and I will then be asking at the end for people with any comments and suggestions to write to me, and we'll consolidate the good ideas, and I'm sure there'll be plenty, and we will forward a consolidated version to Lord Harris. So thank you for joining, and I'm now going to, with great pleasure, hand over to Lord Toby Harris. Toby, welcome. We're going to connect you electronically in a moment.
So the most overquoted ancient Chinese curse, and I have to admit it's actually the only one I know, is "May you live in interesting times." And certainly 2020 was interesting and not the year that any of us expected. If we go back to the beginning of last year, on the 4th of January, the World Health Organization tweeted, and I quote, #China has reported to WHO a cluster of #pneumonia cases with no deaths in Wuhan, Hubei province. Investigations are underway to identify the cause of the illness. And that was virtually the first public announcement of what we would come to call COVID-19. Now, the Nobel physicist Niels Bohr is reputed to have said, "Prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future." And if we go back to the early months of last year, few would have predicted the extent of the global pandemic, nor that we would have to face an even more intense second spike of cases. But we should have been ready. If you look at the course of previous pandemics, COVID has not been so different. Spanish flu hit a peak in the spring of 1918. There was then a more intense peak 6 to 9 months later. And the bad news is that there was then a third peak 6 months after that. And of course, epidemics have occurred traumatically throughout history. Before the Spanish flu, we had in 1349, the Black Death, which killed half all Londoners. And in 1665, there was the Great Plague. All three had a death toll far exceeding that of COVID to date. So it's not surprising that pandemic flu has been in the top tier of the UK's National Risk Register since it was first published a decade ago. But COVID's not flu. And the assessment in the UK register of new and emerging infectious diseases, in which COVID would clearly have fallen, was that they would have a, quote, low likelihood of spreading to the UK and quotes, "The impact could be on the scale of the SARS outbreak in Toronto, Canada, with 251 cases over several months." So in the UK, the risk was logged, but it was not assigned with sufficiently serious level of risk, and it was felt that the preparations in place for a pandemic flu outbreak would probably be sufficient. Now, I'm tempted to dwell at length about what went wrong, but I will try and resist it. And of course, the UK was not alone. Most governments had failures either in preparation or in execution of their COVID response. But the point is, no crisis is ever exactly what you plan for. I don't need to tell you this. And after this crisis or any other major event, many organisations often realise that their risk and response systems have not protected them. Indeed, too often people feel that they've dealt with a potential problem by the mere act of putting it on their risk register. And of course, that risk register is often taken as the last item at a busy board meeting, relegated to the final few minutes as people are packing up their papers to leave. And then when something does happen, when there is a major shock to the system, many organisations pat themselves on the back that they've been resilient if they've managed to bounce back quickly and can speedily return to normal operation. There's nothing wrong with that, but the ambition should be greater. The aim should be to learn from what has happened, not merely so that the particular eventuality that has occurred can be dealt with or avoided if it happens again, but rather to so toughen the organisation that it becomes better able to respond to and avert some completely different threat. As they say, that which does not kill us makes us stronger. And there needs to be a cyclical process of continually learning from experience and using that learning to strengthen the organisation ready for the next crisis. And if there is no crisis, practice and exercise for one. And don't simply breathe a sigh of relief when the exercise is over. Instead, assess what didn't work well and what could have gone better, and fix it for next time. And there will be a next time. At the beginning of last month, Dr. Mike Ryan, head of the emergencies programme at the World Health Organization, said that COVID was a wake-up call. And while the pandemic had been severe and affected every corner of the planet, he said, it's not necessarily the big one. Now, I chair the new National Preparedness Commission. That brings together business, government, academia, and civil society. Our purpose is to promote better preparedness in the UK for a major crisis or incident. At our first meeting in November, we were warned that the world is increasingly volatile and unstable. And this means that as a nation, we need to strengthen our resilience and preparedness against the shocks that are likely as a consequence. A month after that meeting, just before Christmas, a new edition of the National Risk Register was slipped out. This maps 38 major risks facing the country, including environmental hazards, major accidents, malicious attacks, whether they're cyber-based or terrorist, risks arising overseas, and inevitably, animal and human diseases. In my view, the latest version is an improvement on previous iterations. However, it still has its main focus those risks and threats that are likely to appear in the next year or so, which means that longer term but known threats are covered less thoroughly. It's also still rather compartmentalized, and this means that potential cascade effects or interrelated risks, or even that more than one threat might arise simultaneously, are not given the priority that perhaps they should be. And there is an absence of a systemic approach and possibly an inadequate focus on shared consequences. Against each of the risks listed is a statement of the mitigations in place, but these vary in depth and detail with little sense of whether the levels of preparedness are adequate and proportionate to the potential impact and likelihood of the threats identified. But as you will know, there are also a series of global trends that are likely to impact directly or indirectly on the UK, and indeed every other nation, in the coming years. I could talk at length about this, but they include, first, climate change, and that will lead to more extreme weather events, with floods, droughts, storms, heat waves, and heavy rainfall becoming more intense and more frequent. Some parts of the world will become increasingly uninhabitable, driving huge movements of refugees, creating shortages of food and water, and that will have an impact on global supply chains. It will produce political instability that will spill over national borders, and with modern communications, though political instability will be played out on the streets of our polyglot cities hundreds or thousands of miles away. Second, competition for natural resources and insecurity in supply will become more and more intense. The control of energy resources, for example, will give political leverage to those with that control. And we're seeing that play out in terms of Russia and the gas pipeline to Western Europe. Similarly, access to minerals, and in particular rare earth elements, essential for some technologies, will become more and more significant. And just take a look at how China in particular is cornering those markets and buying up control in Africa. And third, there is the changing world order. This is a time of rapid geopolitical change as US preeminence gives way to a multipolar world, with China in particular emerging as a dominant economic power and Russia using hybrid means to maximize its influence. At the same time, there are increasingly powerful non-state actors who may not see, indeed do not see themselves as bound by national laws and regulations. And some of them are engaged in illicit trade and international crime and terrorism. Nearer to home, the UK faces such factors as the vulnerability of existing and aging critical infrastructure. So you've got railways, roads, pumping stations, and other vital services that have suffered from decades of underinvestment and often inadequate maintenance and replacement regimes. And then there is our growing reliance on ever more complex and interconnected systems. This creates vulnerabilities, as in critical services, new systems are overlaid on top of legacy systems in a way which in some cases is now almost impossible to disentangle and beyond the experience of many of those responsible for running and maintaining them. This creates its own risks, even before you consider the possibility of external threats. Events around the globe will affect us potentially dramatically. Some crises will arise suddenly and unexpectedly and require urgent action. Others will develop over decades. So we need to be better prepared for whatever may occur. And that leads us to the other issues that the National Preparedness Commission will be considering. What should we prepare for? How much preparedness is enough? And how do we finance the necessary investment? And the difficulty with this, particularly the last, is that to be properly prepared and resilient is expensive. Now, we've spent decades moving towards a just-in-time economy, one which is apparently more efficient and saves costs. But to adapt to a preparedness philosophy, we need a just-in-case approach. We have to countenance building in redundancy and eschewing interdependence. Now, as a recovering politician, I know how difficult it is for our elected politicians to devote resources, by which I mean the public's tax contributions, to projects that do not come to fruition by the time of the next election or perhaps the one after it. And building resilience that is probably invisible and may never be needed for an eventuality that may not happen. It's not easy. And of course, as that elected politician, it's often impossible to prove that your actions have prevented something happening, particularly if that hypothetical event is at some indeterminate time in the future, and almost certainly long after your term of office is forgotten. Of course, if you fail to do it, and it's needed, you will be pilloried if anyone by then remembers who the politician was who didn't act. So these dilemmas are difficult. None of these questions are easy. But one thing we should learn from 2020 is that we cannot go on burying our heads in the sand. We need to be better prepared for the unexpected. The lesson for all of us, the overriding lesson in every country, is that we have probably not been investing sufficiently in our preparedness and resilience. Above all, we must be prepared to expect the unexpected. I rather like the taxonomy which says we have to be ready not only for the black swans, previously unobserved, high impact, hard to predict rare events, but also the black jellyfishes, things we think we know about and understand, but which turn out to be more complex and uncertain, sometimes with a long tail and a nasty sting at the end. And then the black elephants, challenges visible to everyone, but which no one wants to deal with. We've got to go beyond simply admiring the scale of such problems. And it's not just a nation state issue. Internationally, we have to be better prepared. We will not truly escape the current pandemic until the whole world is vaccinated. And of course, if climate change is to be addressed, there has to be global action. In an increasingly complex and interconnected planet, while one nation may choose to freeload, if too many do, we all fail. And the existential issue for humanity is how long will it be before that is a truth universally accepted. And in any country, preparedness and resilience for any serious threat or crisis cannot just be a matter for the national government. Preparedness matters for every neighbourhood and for every local administration. And indeed, some matters are best organised at community level. And every business and every organisation needs to be more resilient. They need to have considered and planned for how they would respond to transport disruption, a power failure, an inability to access the internet, and for that matter, a global health crisis. And the same principle applies at a household and individual level. There's more of a tradition of that in some countries than in others. Earthquake drills are a regular feature in some places. Others are used to periodic floods or severe storms. Making every organisation and every body more resilient creates a sort of, if I dare use the term, a sort of herd immunity for a society better able to address future global crises, whether it's a new pandemic or a massive cyber attack or climate change. Often the responses needed are threat neutral. The steps necessary are the same, whatever the hazard. The message is resilience needs to be designed in and part of society's fabric. So my questions to you are, is our national risk register fit for purpose? And does it enable us to prepare for real emergencies? What would be the best form of local organisation for civil protection and emergency management? And how do we get local businesses and local neighbourhoods, as well as individuals and households, to be better prepared for emergencies? I said earlier on, we must be prepared to expect the unexpected. Now, be prepared was, of course, Lord Baden-Powell's motto for the Scout movement, so that automatically and instinctively you did the right thing at the right moment. Now, I'm not sure that the 1908 edition of Scouting for Boys or the 1912 version for girls, How Girls Can Help Build Up the Empire, actually spelt out the implications of a global pandemic, but they did at least in embryo equip Baden-Powell's scouts with the principles of civil protection and emergency management. Managing to be actively resilient is good management and good government. It means your organisation, your community or your country is agile and innovative. It means you're empowering your people and engaging with your communities. As a result, you're more likely to be efficient. You're more likely to be successful. Planning and responding to risks is not cost-free, but not doing so is worse. Or as John F. Kennedy put it, there are risks and costs to action, but they are far less than the long-range costs of comfortable inaction. Thank you.